Thank you. Thank you, dear colleagues and friends. Thank you for joining us at the final day, the third day of our virtual symposium on sustainable financing for soil remediation projects in China and beyond. And this is a virtual webinar co-organized by IISD and NIVA. And thank you for joining us again. As before we start this webinar, I'm going to give a quick housekeeping announcement. First of all, this event is being simultaneously interpreted in English and Chinese. At the bottom of the screen, you'll be able to see the translation, the interpretation button. It's a globe-like button, and you just click on that and select your preferred audio channel, English or Chinese. And also, this meeting is being recorded. The recordings and the slides presented by the speakers today will be accessible to the public after this session. And during the session, please feel free to use the chat box or Q&A function to ask any questions you may have to the panelists, and we will collect those questions. And during the discussion part, we'll forward those questions to the panelists. So with that, I'm going to pass the floor to our moderator of today, Liu Hongqiao. Ms. Liu is an award-winning journalist and a policy expert in environment matters in China and the world. And Ms. Liu will give a quick recap of the first 2 days of our virtual symposium and then introduce the theme of today's discussion. Thank you. The floor is yours, Hongqiao.
Thank you, Joe. Hi, everyone. I hope some of you have already followed the first 2 sessions on governance and technology in the past 2 days. But still, I will give you a recap on what we have discussed. On the first day, we'll talk about governance. Our panelists have given a lot of insights on the role of the government on financing, not just financing, but also governing soil remediation in China, the US, and the EU. And the panelists have also agreed on one particular point, that prevention is the key, and prevention should not, and we can't just emphasize prevention enough, even though we're actually talking about soil remediation here. And again, polluters pay is a common principle that has been established in all the 3 countries and the regions that we have discussed in the first session. And the government obviously holds the responsibility of setting clear legislations and set up clear liability for polluters, so that we can actually draw clear lines on who should be paying and financing the projects. And again, standards is also the key. And we touched upon the point of how to avoid that the government has to be to avoid that the government is forced to paying for all the cleanup. And I believe in today's session we'll also touch upon that point again. And the second day, we talked about technology and industry. For the 4 panelists shared some very interesting technologies and some promising technologies applied in China and in the EU. It's very interesting as well that 4 of these panelists shared about some technologies, some approaches based on the nature, either based on plants or waste woods. So it kind of fit in the global discussion right now, which is one of the heated discussed topic on nature-based solutions. And we have also acknowledged in yesterday's session that NBS can be less costly, and it can also serve for multi-benefits, hitting many SDG targets. But again, addressing the science and policy gap is the key. And the communication is also the key, especially when it comes to engagement with local community who are on the frontier of the impact of polluted soil. And I would just stop here and welcome Matthew Groot from IISD. He's a sustainable finance analyst on environmental law and policy to give us a welcome remark. Monsieur, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hongzhou. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all. Many thanks from IISD for being with us today, and obviously our other partners, NIVA, coming to you from Ottawa. So happy to see such a multinational group on the call this morning. Today's session, as Hongzhou was mentioning, will be focused on the challenges associated with financing soil remediation projects. As we heard on Tuesday and Wednesday, soil contamination is a problem faced by most countries, and soil remediation can be quite costly. Our speakers on Tuesday and Wednesday were quite eloquent in discussing the issues facing soil remediation projects, chief of which, to my mind, may be the identification of the actors principally responsible for the contamination, as well as who benefits from the remediation efforts. Again, to my mind today, this discussion is all about who pays and how they'll pay for the cleanup. At the outset of this project, we knew that public funds for remediation were already limited, and private capital was necessary to address these contamination issues. Unfortunately, the fiscal situation for most countries has worsened over the course of our project, as countries have taken on more debt to fund their pandemic recovery plans. This means that now, more than ever, it is important that governments cultivate opportunities to attract private capital to both land remediation, its productive use, and redevelopment thereafter. I was struck on Tuesday by the chart that Dietmar shared, which showed the ratio of public and private capital for contamination remediation projects across the EU. In some countries, such as Norway, private finance is very present. In other countries, such as Portugal, Austria, Italy, national and regional, as well as EU funds, bring the majority of the capital to the table. All this to say, I think we need to think about what works, where, and why. Bringing that capital to projects is one of the main reasons why we are here today. So what are the lessons that we can share towards that goal? In our research, which will be published in the coming months, we have outlined what we believe are potential opportunities to scale funding to soil remediation projects. However, we also recognize that many of the examples we have cited are very context specific and are supported by governance systems that facilitate, or in some cases, force private participation. If you will indulge me, a couple topics I would hope today's discussion could touch on, albeit however briefly, is how to bridge that timing gap between debt financing, perhaps from green bonds, that may be provided at the point of issuance, and then the fact that remediation takes time. That remediated land may not be revenue generating for some time. So how do we bridge that timing gap? Another question is, where in the funding structure would public concessional capital be most effective? Is this during the feasibility stage, actual remediation, or post-remediation development? We have mentioned that, as Hongzhou mentioned earlier, we have mentioned that prevention is going to be key, and that's where we can head a lot of these issues off at the pass. Where would private finance have a role in meeting this challenge? While these may be technical questions, I do think that they're the types of questions that we need to ask in order to ground our discussion and our research in the realities that all stakeholders face. That said, to be honest, I am far more interested in what our panelists have to say on these subjects and their ideas on how to overcome these hurdles. I encourage all the panelists and attendees to read the work on this project that has been generated thus far. I'll put this in the chat during the discussion period, as well as the forthcoming report that has been co-authored by NIVA and IISD, as it provides detailed insights into the issues that we've been raised over the past 3 days. Again, many thanks for joining us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Hongzhou. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, for raising some of the questions. We will touch upon these questions in the moderated discussion and the Q&A. And just a kind of reminder to our audience here, the Q&A session is open. You can already start to pose questions if you have, and address any comments or remarks in that box to specific panelists you have in mind. we will answer. We'll try to answer all the questions in the final session, final half hour of this seminar. And now I just turn the mic to our distinguished guests here. We are very lucky to have 5 very experienced guests to share with us their insights on how private and the public sector, and as well as academia, can come up with solutions and ideas on sustainable financing and innovations on soil remediation in China and beyond. Our first guest is Dr. Zhang Chenghui. She is a former Director General in the Research Institute of Finance Development at the Research Center of China's State Council. She will share with us sustainable finance for soil remediation lessons from the ground. A few more words about Dr. Zhang. She has been working for the State Council's Development Research Center since 1994. She's a very experienced economist, and her focus has been on the financial reform and the financing of small and medium-sized enterprises. She has participated and be responsible for a few dozen research projects in DRC, which is one of the top advisory and think tank of Chinese government, covering and coordinated development strategy and reform in China, for example, and also the master plan for financial system reform. Dr. Zhang will express herself in Chinese. So audience, if you prefer to stick with English, please find the interpretation button at the bottom of the Zoom call, where you can find our very experienced interpreter to give you very smooth translation in English. 张所长，现在就请您发言，您有6分钟的时间，然后在最后1分钟的时候，我会给您一个提示。
Director Zhang, you have about 6 minutes. I will give you some sign to remind you that you only have 1 minute left. The floor is yours. Thank you, moderator. It's my great pleasure to attend this virtual symposium organized by IISD. In 2013, and the Research Institute of Finance, DRC, worked with IISD in a green finance research project. We jointly released a publication on green finance. That is the first thematic publication on green finance. It's my great pleasure to attend this event organized by IISD again. A brief introduction of the Chinese practices in soil remediation. And based upon our researches and surveys with the IISD, we found that the major funding sources for soil remediation mainly come from the government fiscal revenues. First, central fiscal revenue. The Chinese government has a special fund for soil remediation, and the provinces are allocated with those special funds for soil remediation. And the second, based upon the government credibility, and there is fundraising from the financial market, including bank loans and government bonds. And usually those PPP project winning enterprises are the major entities that borrow the money. And the third approach is to raise funds from the enterprises. And one way is for the enterprises to get loans from the banks or issue shares or bonds from the financial market. And this bank borrowing is based upon the credibility of the enterprises, but the financing is supported by the credibility of the enterprises. And the second fundraising model for enterprises is to get financing from the capital market based upon projects. Usually the projects have a stable cash flow. Usually the lenders ask close operation of the funds because for soil remediation, there are practical difficulties. And soil remediation projects are long-term and costly. So from the business perspective, the lenders are not sure of the business prospects of those projects. So they have to look at the capabilities of those projects in generating cash. And China has the principle of polluter pay. But there are some problems with that because for some mines, the mineral resources are already exploited and the mines are no longer there. We couldn't find the responsible parties. So from the historical perspective, it is really hard to trace back the parties responsible for the soil contamination in Tier 1 cities and in some Tier 2 cities. The land value is really high, and for the contaminated land through land leasing and the expenditure for soil remediation can be recovered. So local governments and enterprises, including some foreign invested enterprises, are interested in those soil remediation projects. In particular, some financially sound foreign enterprises are willing to remediate the land, but of course, who pay for that cost? The purchasers of those houses or apartments, the land users, the land purchasers, and pay for the cost of soil remediation. Usually, according to our survey, the remediation cost is 300 to 500 yuan per square meter. That's pretty high. And if there is oil spillover, the oil or petroleum contamination, then the remediation cost is 1,000 to 2,000 square meters. That cost is pretty high for the Tier 1 city governments, and they have to remediate the contaminated soil stage by stage because they do not have so much money to remediate the contaminated land just one time. And I think we have to think about how to better mobilize the private capital to support soil remediation projects. This is one of today's topics for discussion. Last year or in the first half of this year, I do not remember clearly, in recent survey, we visited and surveyed a remediation case from a mining area, a mine. And this case is pretty inspiring. And we also surveyed a remediation case from a desert. And those projects involved private enterprises. And in the mine remediation case, green agriculture and ecosystem tourism and cultural tourism are developed to support the remediation project. And in some projects, after the land is remediated, forestry is developed, or some aged care buildings are built, or the remediated land can be converted into some beautiful parks. Usually the mines are far away from the downtown areas. The value appreciation is limited, so the developers must develop valuable industries to fund the soil remediation projects. And of course, there are some challenges and problems during the implementation of the projects. For example, the special fund for the remediation of abandoned mines provided by the central government is there, but usually the implementing companies of those projects cannot get the money directly. Sometimes there is the special fund appropriation by local governments because the county level governments have a pretty tight budget. Their financial revenues are really tight, so they may appropriate that money. And compared with the state-owned enterprises, the private enterprises find it difficult to get the special fund, although in principle, there shouldn't be any discrimination against the private enterprises. That's all from me. Thank you very much, Director Zhang. Very high-level insights.
I mean, I personally already have a lot of questions to ask to Dr. Zhang, and dear attendees, please also start to type your questions in the Q&A box. The second speaker is Professor Wang Lan, Associate Professor of Law in the East China Normal University. She will share with us a case study of more details on China's funding system for soil pollution prevention and control. Professor Wang Lan received her PhD from the Research Institute of Environmental Law in Wuhan University, and her research area has always been environmental laws and policies. In the past 10 years, she focused on the study of compensation for ecological and environmental damages, for the funding mechanisms for environmental protection, and the fund for soil prevention and control. So this is really her topic, and we let's just welcome Professor Wang Lan to give us more details on how the soil remediation fund in China functions. The floor is yours.
Thank you for giving me the chance to attend the seminar. I want to briefly introduce Chinese fund system for soil pollution prevention and control. And for a long time, China didn't pay enough attention to soil pollution. And the soil pollution prevention and control law wasn't enacted until 2019. But as we know that in the past 40 years, with the rapid development of the industrialization and the urbanization, and the pressure of soil safety and health is increasing, and the social demand for control and remediation of polluted soil is extremely urgent. So from April 25, and to December 2030, China conducted the first national survey of soil pollution, covering an area about 603 million square kilometers. We released the action plan for soil pollution control on May 31, 2016. Some remediation of polluted soil has become the most important part of soil pollution prevention control. So the development of the Chinese soil pollution control fund system can be divided into 3 stages. Before 2011, there's no special funds for soil pollution and control, but others environment funds have some relationship with soil pollution control and remediation. And since 2011, we have begun to accelerate the release of national and local soil pollution control policies, standards, and some regulations. And since 2016, we have built and developed a special fund system for soil pollution prevention and control. Next, I will introduce the legal framework and content of this fund for soil pollution prevention and control. There are 3 parts of this framework. The first part is some laws. The environmental law is the most important law. this environmental law provide a legal basis for the fund system. There are some articles such as 28, Article 62, Article 50. As Article 50, the people's government at all levels should allocate funds from the financial budget to support the protection of the land of drinking water source, to support the prevention and the control of soil pollution, the rural industrial pollution. Article 15 of the Environment Protection Law is the basis for the establishment of various environmental protection funds. And it's also the basis for the establishment of soil pollution prevention and control funds.
Professor Wang Lai, excuse me, I have to interrupt you. You have only 1 minute left. Do you want to,
okay.
Could you please make a few key points before we close? Thank you.
Okay. The second law is the soil pollution prevention and control law. At the Article 71, the state shall grant more funds for the prevention and control of soil pollution. And then we released some administrative rules and regulations, such as administrative measures on the financial capital of soil pollution prevention and control, and the administrative measures on the funds of soil pollution prevention and control, and the other administrative rules and regulations. And there are some local regulations, such as Jilin province release the local regulations for soil prevention. And at the present, we have found the special funds for soil pollution. It's one content of special funds for ecological and environment protection. The special funds for soil pollution of the soil pollution prevention and control can be divided into two parts: a central earmarked fund and a prevention fund. Okay, this is my speech. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Wang. I hope we can discuss more on the legal framework of soil fund system in China in our moderated discussion. And it's a pity that we couldn't cover everything you have prepared during the presentation due to our limited time, but we will do that in the moderated discussion. Thank you again. The next speaker is Mr. Kenneth Patterson. Mr. Patterson will share with us, as his colleague already forecast in the first session of governance, some on-ground practice on how to incentivize the financing of hazardous waste contamination cleanups. Mr. Peterson is a division director at the Office of Site Remediation Enforcement in the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. He has been working on developing and implementing national enforcement policy, and he hosts a management position in both IISD, that is the Regional Support Division, as well as the OSRE, that is the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, and has served as both the Acting Deputy Office Director of a few EPA officers. And I will just be short. And I mean, in addition to his management responsibilities, he represented the EPA in Superfund reauthorization discussions on Capitol Hill from 1995 to 1998. He has a lot of experience to share with us. And I will just turn the floor to Mr. Peterson. And again, you only have 6 minutes. Please keep it short. Or you'll have more discussion in details on particular questions in the moderated discussion. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It is certainly my honor to be a part of this distinguished panel this morning. Next slide, please. Just a reminder about some things you've already learned about the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, things you've already heard about the American legal system that addresses hazardous waste contamination. When Congress passed this law in 1981, it favored prompt cleanup of abandoned hazardous waste sites and having responsible parties pay for those cleanups. They enacted at the time what was a very broad set of authorities to insist upon companies that had been responsible for pollution to clean up those sites. And those groups, as you've heard already, include not only the parties who operated or owned the sites in the past, but those that currently own the sites, regardless of whether or not they have actually been a part of any of the pollution activities. It's also important to note that our legislative framework calls on federal government agencies to do their part in paying for the cleanup. For example, our departments of energy and departments of interior and other agencies that have operated sites also have to provide financing for sites under their control. Next slide. As you may have heard, as I said, it is a very comprehensive law imposing strict liability, with strict liability meaning without fault. A company who has been responsible for one of these sites being created must pay for its cleanup, regardless of whether they followed every applicable law at the time that they operated the site, or whether they complied with all sound scientific principles and how they operated the site. It's also retroactive liability. We can look back in time and cause parties from many, many years ago, assuming we can still find that they have resources, we can insist upon them cleaning up the site. And finally, the liability is joint and several. We can make one party responsible for a site among many pay for the entire cleanup, though we do try to be fair in how we allocate responsibility among multiple companies. Next slide, please. There are exceptions to this. I won't spend a lot of time on those today, but things like an act of God, a flood, a hurricane, something like that that causes a release of hazardous substances, one would not be liable for those. We also have special exemptions for the banks that loan money to American companies to ensure that if they merely take possession of the property to foreclose upon a delinquent loan, they're not responsible for the pollution expense. Also, companies or entities such as cities that only supply day-to-day trash are not responsible under Superfund. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about the process that we use to identify the parties that have contributed to the cleanup or the need for cleanup at a particular site. It's important to remember that almost 70% of the financial responsibility for cleaning up hazardous waste sites has been borne by the private parties, the companies that operated the sites, as opposed to the federal government. As you have heard this week, there is the other 30% is paid for out of the appropriated dollars received by EPA. When the system was first created in 1981, there was a tax on oil companies and other chemical companies that was used to pay for the cleanup that was not attributable to the private entities, but that tax has now sunset. It is no longer in place. So any money that we spend comes from the federal budget. Back to the process. Once we discover a site and start its active investigation into how to best clean it up, at the same time, we are beginning to search for all of the parties who either owned the site, operated it, transported hazardous substances to the site, or who generated the waste in other places and brought it to one of these sites. Once we identify the responsible parties, we negotiate with them and offer them a chance to settle with the government, to by agreement decide how they're going to pay for the site. And if we settle with them, then we oversee the cleanup. If we don't settle, we have the authority to issue an order to them to force them to do the cleanup. And once they are cooperating and perform the cleanup, again, we oversee how they are doing that. If they refuse to abide by the unilateral order where I have listed no compliance, we pursue other enforcement options such as suing them. So next slide, please. We enter into administrative orders by agreement for the smaller sites where only a short-term removal of hazardous substances is necessary. But for the more comprehensive cleanups, what we call remedial cleanups, we enter into court overseen agreements with them that the federal courts help oversee. And where necessary, litigation occurs to force the companies to comply as needed. But while we are in the process of implementing the cleanup, those parties have to provide financial assurance to ensure that they will be able to finish the cleanup. So they have to set aside money to make sure that they are able to complete the cleanup they promised to do. And we allow them to use insurance, bonds, or letters of credit to guarantee that work. Next slide, please. By way of incentive, because we have an extremely tough law that requires cleanup, we do try to be fair in how we implement it. For example, we will allow the parties to pay on average about 25% of less of the cost of cleaning up the site if there are many parties at the site that we can no longer identify. Again, we try to be fair in how we allocate responsibility, and we often discover, as my Chinese government colleague has indicated a moment ago, that we cannot find all the parties that had contributed to the site. We will also provide what is called mixed funding, where we agree to pay part of a site and the private, or by we, I mean the government, and the private parties pay the remainder. That is often in the situation where the orphan share is much greater than 25%, or where we have litigation risk in pursuing the party. Maybe our case is not as strong as we would like. We also collect money sometimes from parties at the site who are smaller parties, and we put that money into a special account. And we allow the larger parties who are paying for or performing the cleanup to access the money to help them pay for that cleanup. Next slide, please. Another significant incentive for American companies is that our law allows them to sue other companies that were responsible for the cleanup if the former company has paid more than its fair share, more than its equitable share at the site. They may sue other companies at the site to provide that they help pay for the cleanup. And when they do settle with the United States, we do give them contribution protection, which protects the settling parties from being pursued by other parties. Next slide, please. We allocate, as I said, the portions of responsibility based upon various factors. Next slide, please. I think it's important because we do have limited resources. It's important that we prioritize the most important or most contaminated sites in the country, what we call the national priorities list, and those sites get priority for government funding. That's all of my remarks today. I'm happy to join my colleagues at question and answer time. So thank you. I will turn the floor back over to our kind moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Patterson. It's interesting. I mean, later we will compare the two different systems in China and the US, and I kind of get the impression based on the two speakers who just shared their presentation that in the US we have seen a more a system that is built on law, very stringent law, as Mr. Peterson just shared. And while in China, we, in the past, at least we are built, what have been done in the past has been more administrative orders, measures, and the government paying for most of the bills. But till recently, the law, more comprehensive and holistic law is put on place. But of course, we're going to ask Professor Lan later about how stringent it is and about issues about implementation. And right now, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Miss Ingvild Ferusas, who is a research assistant at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research. She is an environmental economist working at one of our co-organizers, NIVA, the Norwegian Institute of Water Research. And in her position, Ingvild works on a range of research topics related to ecosystem service valuation, financing mechanisms, and the policies to support sustainable measures and reduce adverse environmental efforts. And here she is going to share with us some of the international cases of green financing for remediation projects. The floor is yours.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Hong Chao. Before starting, I'm pleased to be able to contribute to this symposium based upon our earlier good cooperation on the theme, green financing of soil remediation projects in China. Our report, next slide, please. Green finance approaches to soil remediation, international examples, is centered around some selected case studies from throughout the world, exemplifying approaches to soil remediation and their green financing solutions. Every case gives some important lessons, and to learn even more, check out the report. And here we have kind of structured them around what kind of approach that has been used. Next slide, please. In our work, we use this framework. In each case, we looked at the background of the remediation program or project, identified financial actors, instruments, sources, and recipients, and assessed the costs and risks. Next slide, please. So legislation is important, and many countries worldwide follow the polluter pays principle, as we've been hearing earlier today. Although the polluter shall pay in principle, in many cases it is not feasible because of difficulties in identifying the polluters, or the polluter doesn't exist anymore, or do not have the financial means to fund remediation. Some countries have a broad definition of a polluter. For instance, the landowner may be considered a polluter, which can make it easier to obtain funding. However, in many cases, there are a need for other financing approaches to soil remediation. So international experience shows that the choice of a suitable financing approach can give good value for money and also attract private capital. Different remediation cases require different types of financing models. We found that the potential value of land is important for selecting financing models. Consequently, the location of the property and end use are key. Also, the required remediation effort and hence the costs will be decisive for development of profitable projects. And next slide, please. It might be easier to mobilize private funding for remediation in urban areas, as these allow for more profitable developments compared to rural areas. In this case, debt credit enhancement, tax incentives, and equity investment could be applied. Some remediation projects do not offer any clear commercial opportunities and will not necessarily result in any revenue streams after restoration. These projects therefore require more public funding and philanthropic contributions. And both public-private partnerships and crowdfunding may be effective financing avenues in these circumstances. So in sum, as seen from our cases, there is no uniform approach, and actors and institutions are recommended to apply a financing mechanism that is the best fit for purpose for the planned remediation project, taking into account case-specific circumstances, including socioeconomic context, income potential, complexity of pollution, and time frame. You can see some examples in our report. In addition, our work found that the most successful examples of remediation funds had a stable revenue stream, as for example, the Denmark versus Superfund and Clean Michigan initiative cases. There are examples on remediation funds where government support ceased, and as a result, many contaminated sites still need to be remediated. For that reason, it is important to ensure continuity of funding when forming a fund, and that continuity may be ensured by tax on polluting industries, regular grants from general fiscal revenue, or through revolving loan funds, amongst others. Next slide, please. So to sum up, international experience shows that the choice of a suitable financing approach can give good value for money and also attract private capital. I wish to express our gratitude for everyone who contributed to this report series and to our listeners. Thank you.
Thank you, Inge-Ville. You're sharp in time. You actually saved 1 minute for our next speaker. And just before introducing the next speaker, I just to share a little bit thoughts on this. Above the 4 speakers and also all the speakers we had in the last session have been focusing on one specific issue, that is how to fund soil remediation. But at the same time, we need to, in today we're facing a lot of challenges. We have climate crisis, we have biodiversity loss, we have, water crisis, among others. And how do we see soil as not just a field to produce crops, to build buildings, but also see the value that has been embedded, for example, in terms of carbon storage and carbon sinks, and to see the value of a healthy soil in adapting and mitigating climate the crisis that we're facing. And with that remark in mind, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Tiago Chagas, I believe I pronounced it correctly, who is the lead legal consultant at Climate Focus. And he's going to share with us a presentation on financing ecosystem-based adaptation measures. Mr. Chagas is a lead consultant, as I just said. He has been working on climate policy, and he's also legal advisor specializing in climate change, regulatory issues, and climate finance. He has extensive experience in providing policy and regulatory support to public entities developing land use, landscape, and jurisdictional programs. He has also advised several companies and non-government organizations on establishing the optimal legal structure for an area of land use and mitigation projects. And I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Chagas. You also have 6 minutes, and I'll give you a reminder when you have only 1 minute left. And attendees, please, again, welcome your comments and questions. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and good afternoon or good morning to the organizers and all the participants. It is very nice to be joining this workshop and contributing to this very interesting discussion on financing soil remediation. I think that where my participation can add some value is essentially by highlighting that there are a few financing mechanisms out there which are looking to funding adaptation to climate change in a manner that can also contribute considerably to maintaining or restoring soil quality, soil health, or land productivity more generally. And one approach in particular that we at Climate Purpose assessed in a report that we prepared back in 2018 for the GIZ, which is the German Agency for International Cooperation, was the so-called EBA approach, or ecosystems-based adaptation approach, which is essentially a set of actions that promote adaptation to climate change by leveraging ecosystem services and biodiversity, and which often attributes a stronger role to local communities in implementing those actions and also benefiting from those as well. If we could go to the next slide, please. So in this report, what we did was basically provide an overview of the existing financing mechanisms and channels for those types of ecosystem-based adaptation measures, and how these funding sources could actually be tapped by project developers, by enterprises, by NGOs, local communities, and governments themselves. And among the financing examples and modalities that we assessed in that report were public sources of finance made available at international level by multilateral funds, such as the Green Climate Fund, which is the main financing mechanism of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, but also, for instance, the Pilot Program for Resilience, which is a fund that sits under the Climate Investment Funds, which in turn is run by a number of multilateral development banks. We also looked into funding that is made available bilaterally by countries. So, for instance, by the German International Climate Initiative, the IKI, where that funding is often disbursed as a grant and is then complemented by some level of finance at the domestic level. And in some cases also by municipal fees and charges, which are implemented by municipalities and then serve to contribute and support those adaptation measures. Now, of course, when I say that there are a number of public international financing mechanisms available out there, I do mean to say that these public channels are easily accessible or that they provide finance at the necessary scale, especially when we consider the size of the challenge that we face in terms of land restoration. Also, I think it's important to note that in most cases, accessing resources of public international funds will require a lot of time and a lot of technical expertise of those designing the project and putting forward the funding proposals. So really, for greater scale and greater accessibility of finance for land, for soil, or for ecosystem restoration more broadly, we really need the private sector to come in. And with the private sector, of course, I don't mean just the farmers or the local companies, but also the international supply chain, including companies, the banks, the retail, and the institutional investors. And of course, we also need those private actors to shift the way they look into this type of finance. And in a way, just to conclude, I think this is happening now, maybe not at the speed we wanted or wish, but still happening. And I think where we can see some interesting developments on finance for land and soil restoration is, of course, now carbon credits. There is, at the moment, a gold rush for carbon credits, and offsetting for soil carbon sequestration activities is gaining momentum, is gaining traction, in particular in the US. We also have insetting involving, for instance, landscape restoration and agroforestry activities. And for those who are not familiar with the term, insetting is an approach similar to carbon offsetting, but here the intervention happens within the supply chain of a particular company. So it is not really leading to carbon credits at the end, but to other types of verified impacts. And there are also interesting developments in terms of the significant increase we saw in impact funding vehicles in terms of private debt or equity, and conservation investments that target, among others, landscape restoration. So all those developments, they were also noted in our report in 2018 as a potential source of finance for ecosystem-based adaptation. But their growth and traction really accelerated since last year. So I think those are really important financing instruments to be discussed here. I will stop here. I'm sure there will be more to discuss in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So actually, I was swept the sequence a little bit because we have a very important question raised in the Q&A session about the definition of sustainable finance that we're talking about here. And I think it's better to set the record straight before we continue the discussion. What is exactly sustainable finance for soil remediation? And I'm going to pose the question to at least to three speakers. First to Dr. Zhang Chenghui, then maybe turning to Diego, and then Mathieu, if you have anything to add. What do we mean sustainable finance when we discuss in this context of soil remediation? 张所长，能不能请您先给个大概的一个定义？我们讨论的可是
Director Zhang, could you please give us a definition of sustainable finance? What does it mean? It is a tough question. Sustainable finance, in essence, means that finance must serve the sustainability of economy and society, and finance itself has to be sustainable, because on many occasions, we say that we shall not mix finance with a fiscal system. You can get the fiscal fund free, but for financial resources, the financial institutions, the investors are not philanthropists. And it is not a kind of a donation. The financial investors invest. They have to recover their investment and get certain revenue. That's sustainable finance. If we go back to soil remediation, I think the foundation of sustainable finance is that for soil remediation, it must be able to generate economic benefit and also social benefit. If there isn't a big enough economic benefit from soil remediation projects, that finance is not sustainable, or it is only partially sustainable. The projects will need fiscal subsidy, or it might be a blended finance. It is not totally sustainable. So that's my answer.
This point is very clear that finance is not in a lot of cases, that is government who pays the bill to finance at least a big part of soil remediation projects. This shouldn't be considered as charity. Tiago, do you have anything to add from the perspective of climate adaptation finance?
Yeah, I don't think I have too much more to add. I would say that sustainable finance, it should be investments that are seeking returns, of course, but they also need to lead to positive impacts. That's, I think, very important. It's not enough just to reduce negative impacts, but they actually need to lead to positive impacts. The question is what sort of positive impacts and how we measure them. I think thus far it has been, mostly steered towards climate impacts and mostly about mitigation so far. So that's a very narrow way to look at it. There's so much more from the environmental side, but also from the social side and social impacts which are not presently covered. But things are advancing even in Europe, even though we have now the EU taxonomy defining what is sustainability and how you invest in sustainable activities. For now, it's mostly about climate change, but in future it should expand to other issues as well. So we might have a better definition of sustainable finance in the next years as well.
Thank you, Matthew. Do you want to share a few more comments?
Yeah, sure, I can jump in. I know, and let me be very clear, I do not represent IISD's views on this, and but I think, to my mind, we need to think about sustainable finance. Whenever I hear the term, it's become this umbrella term that encompasses a lot of different things. And to my mind, there is finance that goes towards sustainable projects, and there is how we can transition finance to a more sustainable future. And what I mean by that is that I think when we talk, the largest issue that we're seeing in the space of talking about sustainable finance is this issue of how to get traditional finance flows into more sustainable projects. And I think when we talk about sustainable finance, we think of how we can get, I would say, those big asset managers, those big investment managers, pension plans, things like that, institutional investors into green projects. And to my mind, that's not going to happen anytime soon. And the emergencies that we're facing right now, we cannot wait for that to happen. I think we need to look at traditional finance and how to move them into assets that are, I would say, not negative towards what our climate goals are. And that can be sustainable finance in and of itself. And then there are always going to be, I would say, investors, government funds, philanthropic organizations that will also make sure that we're moving the needle towards what I would say social progress and progress on the climate. So I think it's important that sometimes when we use, and I appreciate the question and that Morten brought it up, because it's sometimes difficult to ascertain what we're actually talking about when we use this broader term. So that is, again, that's just my view. And I know that there are others on the call that might have others, but I think I saw that Ingvild, our Norwegian counterpart, had her hand up as well and might have a view on this.
Yes, please. Ingvild, do you have anything to add on that point?
Yeah, no, actually, Thiago mentioned the taxonomy on sustainable activities that I wanted to mention. And I think that even though it's just for the EU, it will probably have an impact on the financing system throughout the world. And that by implementing this, we will move towards more sustainable financing.
Great, thanks. And I think again, Morten, who raised your question, I hope this gives you a more bigger picture of what we're talking about here. We're talking about finance, not charity. We're talking about positive impacts, which can come with co-benefits in either public health, environmental health, climate, biodiversity, a few different impacts, different measurements depending on the priority of each context, I think. And we do have standards, as Ingvild just shared, that, for example, in EU we have the sustainable finance taxonomy, and in China we also have similar taxonomy, but a little bit different than the EU structure. But that's kind of the base of our discussion. And right now I want to pose a question to two speakers. One is Dr. Zhang Zhenhui, and the other is to Ken, who is from EPA. Can you give us a more? Can you give us a bit more detail about how much finance gap are we talking about in China and the US about financing soil remediation? What's the finance gap? And based on that, we'll continue our discussion about how to mobilize finance to fill that gap. 张所长，您可不可以先回答一下这个问题？
Mr. Zhang, can you answer that first? You are muted. Okay, so I have not calculated these finance gap for soil remediation because this is not my expertise. But when we did the SPS on the CCICED, we used the soil remediation as an example to illustrate the conservation finance and biodiversity finance. And we illustrate that the needs for this conservation finance and biodiversity finance is really big, but we have not estimated the finance need for soil remediation. But let me just give a small example. In Shandong, we actually visited a remediation project for a mine, and they have introduced similar things. So basically, the mine, the minerals were extracted, and then the site was abandoned, and then there were a lot of waste, and the wastewater was flowing, and no plants could actually grow. And in Shandong, in one province, there are altogether 8,000 such mines just in one province. And only very few of them have been remediated and recovered. So I think in terms of the soil remediation, the workload is really big in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, just to give the attendees a little bit context, China conducted the first national survey on contaminated on soil back in 2011, 12, I believe, a few years ago, and the result is that about 1/6 of the samples on agricultural land has been tested, polluted. That means it's above national standard, and we've seen other data on different type of soil. So we are in China at least dealing with a lot of contaminated land, and again, we need to talk about prioritize what to repair and how to repair with what methods. And with that, I just again turn to Ken from the EPA. Can you share with us a little more information about the financing gap?
I'm happy to, yes. The CERCLA law was first enacted and they created a tax on the chemical and oil companies to help address those sites that private industry was not available to clean up. The thinking was in 1981 that we were going to collect enough money to immediately clean up all the sites. That has not proven to be the case. While we have approximately 1,200 sites on the national priorities list, there are tens of thousands of other sites throughout the country that are at different stages of needing study and cleanup. Each year, as far as using the appropriated dollars from Congress to clean up sites, we have more sites ready for cleanup for which there is no private financing than we can get to on any given year. So we have a pipeline where we have to address them based upon the most contaminated sites. One thing I didn't, and because we only have so much time together here today, I didn't focus on in my remarks, but some of my colleagues have talked about, is the importance of incentivizing companies who are currently not responsible parties to invest in contaminated sites. Developers who may see a business opportunity by cleaning up a site for which they currently have no responsibility, to incentivize them to clean up those sites is another focus that the agency has right now. And the way that we do that is we don't give them financial incentives, but what we do is we make them eliminate their concerns that they will be brought in and have to pay for the entire site by saying if they will take certain steps at a site, we won't hold them liable for all of the pollution at the site. So private financing is also an important part of EPA's focus right now, but something I did not focus on today. I hope that's responsive to your question.
Thank you. It's interesting you bring up the business opportunity perspective. In China, we also, when I covered soil remediation 8 to 9 years ago, we've been hearing information from the industry who claim that this will potentially become a $1 trillion RMB scale of market. But has it become a reality in, for example, in the US, where you have longer history of soil remediation? And this is not just a question for you, but also maybe for Dr. Zhang Suozhang. But I would hear from you first. Do you see the opportunity become real, or is just more like a bubble or a pie that we're drawing for the future to incentivize private sector to join in?
Well, let me divide that into two parts. First of all, as to the cost of the remediation, the $1 trillion you referred to. When I began in the program, the average cost of cleaning up a site was around $25 million US. That's when I began in the program in 1988. Now we have sites, including large sediment sites and bodies of water, that are in the billions of dollars as to their cleanup estimates. So like everything else, the cost of cleanup has increased. As far as the opportunity presented here, we are in the early stages, I believe, at EPA of incentivizing private developers who don't have association with sites to become more involved in them. I think it is a huge business opportunity, but we have a long way to go to incentivize people to help address those sites that we just currently don't have the resources to address.
Thank you, Ken. Zhang Suozhang,
so Ms. Zhang, are you willing to take up the question? Yes, okay, I agree with what Mr. Ken said. Well, you talk about this trillion market. Maybe this is not a very precise or accurate description, because from an economic perspective, this is the need is kind of this is different. So you said maybe we have these 1/6 of these sites, and then we have a lot of sites to be remediated, but will they turn into a real investment opportunities? That's another thing, because actually what we need to recover or remediate, can this soil bring financial return to the investors or to the bankers? So can it bring real business opportunities? So this is a this concept is different from such a big demand of investment or need of investment. So as our expert said, we have to divide it into two parts. I think one part does not have a commercial return, and then maybe we need to have a government funding or attracting philanthropic or charity funding or other approach to address the issues. And then the other part is that there could be some financial return or commercial return. Through remediation, we can really increase the value of the soil or the land so they can capture the value in the market. So in this case, we can have the private sector to really conduct the work. So that's my opinion.
And I will turn the microphone to Professor Wang Lan. That's kind of, I mean, it's a follow-up to what Dr. Zhang Zhenhui has just addressed. How can we incentivize the private sector to participate in soil remediation that doesn't have a clear business return? Does the current soil fund system in China, is it designed to bring in private sector's involvement, or is designed to just, to make sure that the government public finance can be efficiently mobilized and implemented, used for soil remediation? Can you share a little bit more on that, please?
Yes, of course. And well, just now, just a follow-up to the interventions of our two professors. And I see that in terms of the action plan on soil contamination prevention and control, and there is actually a national goal for the remediation. By 2020, the safe utilization rate of contaminated farmland will be 90%. And also the safe utilization rate of the contaminated site will also reach 90%. And then by 2030, it would reach 95%. So I think actually some scholars and some magazines share the figure that the financing need for farmland remediation would be 66.7 billion yuan. And in terms of the central government budget, the special fund on the soil remediation in 2011, the annual budget was 4.4 billion. So actually, there is a goal, and there's also a need, a demand, and there are also government budget there, government investment there. So let me also just add something about the fund for the legal framework for the fund on soil remediation, prevention, and control. So according to the identification of the liabilities, there are two categories. One is that we have the polluters, we have very clear responsible parties, and these responsible parties are able to bear all the responsibilities. So then in this legal terms, we have these polluter pay principle, and then there's also this so-called public interest litigation system in place, so that the responsible parties can actually bear the responsibilities. And the second category is what I talk about, which is that the fund mechanism for the soil remediation, prevention, and control. And this national fund mechanism is to address those orphan sites, the sites that do not have a clear response. For example, some sites where they are responsible parties, but those responsible parties cannot afford or do not have the resources to bear all the responsibilities. And then second is the orphan site. So because in China, we used to have a planned economy, so there were some state-owned factories and state-owned mining companies, and they were invested by the state. So eventually the liability also by the so for these two categories, there are different procedures designed there. So for the first category, this is actually be responsible for the damage, and if the responsible parties abandon the site, well, if there's if for these are orphan sites where you for the second category, then the government would actually need to bear the responsibilities, and that's why they have set up this fund system. And now in my slide, I also talk about
in the PowerPoint, I mentioned several departmental regulations, and for 2 departmental regulations, one is the management method for the solute pollution prevention and control fund, and the other is also about the fund management approach. And these 2 policies are the major policies and regulations that we should follow when managing the solute pollution prevention and control fund. So there is the central earmarked fund mechanism, and there is the provincial fund mechanism. I mentioned the solute pollution prevention and control fund management method. And this is mainly about the first type of fund, the central earmarked fund. And that regulation was released to manage the central government earmarked fund, and the other policy is for the provincial level funds management. So we have 2 regulations governing the management of solute pollution prevention and control funds. One is for the central earmarked fund, the other is for provincial funds. And for the central government fund management measures, they support risk control, assessment capacity, and survey capacity. And solute remediation is just a part of the scope of that regulation. And from 2016, if we look at the application scope of the earmarked funds, according to our surveys, most of the funds are used in the development of monitoring and assessment capacities. The funds are not directly used in solute remediation projects. And when that regulation was released in 2016, there have been 2 amendments, and the latest amendment was in 2020, and this new regulation has 5-year validity. It will be amended further in the future. So in fact, we do not have a complete funding system for solute pollution prevention and control. And Professor Wang, could you please answer the question I asked just now? In terms of the design of the existing funding system, does it include a private fund, or it is just a fund pool that only includes the government fiscal fund? In fact, in a design, it considers the private fund. For the central earmarked fund, it mainly comes from the central government fiscal revenue. So there is only one source of revenue, the central government fiscal revenue. But for the provincial funds, according to the management regulation, the funds include the fiscal revenues and the fiscal budget. It also includes the funds established with the involvement of a social capital. And in the future, more regulations will be released to govern the involvement of private capital. And there will be mechanisms to attract the private capital, and there will be more regulations to regulate the utilization of those private funds. For the provincial funds, they have to be established based upon market-oriented rules, and their establishment and exit must be based upon the market rules. So these are the principles. But as for the specific operation, we have to wait and see the detailed provisions. The provincial provisions might differ. In addition to the funds, there is a special fund for the ecological system conservation and rehabilitation. There is also environmental protection fund. The provincial fund management regulations are not comprehensive. In 2020, Jilin province released the provincial fund management regulation, but not all provinces have released their management regulations for the provincial funds. So usually, the management of those funds refers to the central government fund management regulation, and there is also environmental protection fund management regulation. There is the air pollution prevention and control fund and water pollution prevention and control fund. And there are provincial level fund management regulations. Thank you, Professor Wang.
Would you like to pose a question to the peer panelists? Please go ahead.
Are you talking to me? Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to ask you a question both to the Chinese and the American peers here. To what extent do the current legislation hinder or disencourage private investment in contaminated soil or brownfields?
Did you direct that at me? Oh, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, Ken, please, you can go ahead. Yeah.
My pleasure. The private investment by developers and other entities into contaminated sites, the way it is discouraged is that if you buy or come to have title to a piece of property under our system, under our legislative framework, you become a responsible party for its cleanup. And so, for example, if a site is extremely contaminated and we have not fully studied it and don't know how much the eventual remediation will cost, and you decide to buy that property to invest in it, it may cost much more money for you to that you have become responsible for by being the owner of the property. So often the way we look at these sites, or the government tries to give incentives to parties by telling them that if they take on the remediation, we will in some way limit their exposure to the full cost of that remediation. But over the years, our strict liability scheme has discouraged investment in these properties, which has caused people to invest, rather than in contaminated property, to invest in what we call green fields, uncontaminated property, which results in sprawl. It results in more green properties being invested in, as opposed to cleaning up the contaminated ones. So that is a disincentive. We have a whole brownfields program at EPA where we give grants and revolving loans to address certain types of contaminated properties, but the problem is still a rather significant one.
Thank you. You also want to ask Professor Lan and Dr. Zhang Chenghui, right?
Yes, we'd also focus on how to overcome this.
张教授，张所长，您先来。
好的，我说一下，中国的法律从来都。
Director Zhang, I want to tell you that the Chinese laws and the regulations do not create barriers for the private investors to invest in soil rehabilitation and remediation. Private capital is encouraged by the Chinese government to invest in soil remediation. But there might be some influencing or inhibiting factors, but those are not from the legal system. They might be the technical difficulties. For example, a company wanted to restore or remediate the land. There is the issue of land leasing. As you know, the land in China belongs to the government, the state, and in the countryside, the farmers have the contracting right of the farmland or other land. If you want to get the land from the farmers, you may not get consistent price. For example, one farmer wants to transfer the contracting right to you at a certain price, but another farmer may ask for a higher price. So it is an issue of complicated business negotiations. If the local governments support those projects, usually the local governments support the investment companies to persuade the farmers to transfer the contracting rights to the companies. If the lands are piecemeal, usually you do not get high benefits from the land remediation. Usually you have to get a pretty and vast land in order to create the scale effect and get economic benefits. So you have to have shared interests with the farmers. And one of the developers that we surveyed established a cooperative, and the company developed some tourism facilities. And the farmers transfer their contracting rights to the company. The farmers get some income from that, and the farmers can also find jobs in the local tourism industry. So my point is that it is not the laws or regulations that inhibit private investment in soil remediation. Mainly the technical difficulties are hindering the private investment. It is hard for private enterprises to get loans from the banks because the banks ask for collaterals and guarantee to avoid risks. In soil remediation, there are no collaterals. If the company is really small and the company cannot find some guarantor, the company will face a lot of difficulties in getting bank loans. The banks may not accept the contracting right or operating right of the land as the collateral. And of course, it is even more difficult for the private companies to get funds from the capital markets. The companies are really small. They cannot get IPO to raise money. If they issue bonds, the cost will be a lot higher than bank loans because the companies have to approach the securities and investment banks to work as intermediaries, and there must be road shows and pitching. Essential, the investors must buy the bonds, and that cost of bond issuance might be even higher than bank loans. So these are the technical difficulties. There might be some indirect impact from the legal system. For example, the bank loans are usually short-term loans. And as mentioned by the panelists, soil remediation projects are long-term, and short-term loans cannot support this long-term investment and recovery period in soil remediation projects. And there is the general regulation on lending, which regulates all the lending behaviors of the banks. If you have to associate those inhibiting factors with the legal system, I think maybe that general regulation on lending restricts the lending behaviors of the banks. And the banks must follow the government regulations, or else if they lend the money beyond the scope of those legal regulations, the banks might be subject to greater risks and the cost might be higher, but there is no direct impact from Chinese legal system and for the private capital to invest in soil remediation, but there might be some indirect impact from the legal system. I don't know whether I have answered your question or not.
Thank you. Dr. Zhang just shared a few challenges in implementing some even well-designed policies on the ground. We also tackle one of the issues about the community engagement. How can we mobilize the participation of local community to projects like this? I will pose the question. I'll pose a question to Ken. Sorry, I just want to make sure if Professor Lan, do you have anything to add to the question that Inge Wille just asked?
Hello. In fact, I think the remarks of Dr. Zhang are very clear. The Chinese laws and regulations have considered the traceability issue of responsible parties in the water and soil prevention, pollution prevention and control laws. When the responsible parties are not identifiable, the governments will be held responsible. If you buy a land and the polluters, the previous polluters are no longer there, then before you buy the land, the property, you have to evaluate the risks of the land to make sure that the property you buy is valuable. And this is linked with the fund system I mentioned. When the responsible parties are identified, of course, they have to be held responsible, but in cases where the polluters are not identifiable, then the government will serve as the last resort. So we have considered all those situations.
Okay, thank you for your insights. I have a question to first to ask this question to Ken. I mean, after decades of operation of the Superfund, if, let's say, assuming you have the chance to redesign or to upgrade some of the rules that have already been established in the circular, what improvements would you push at the moment? And considering that our Chinese colleagues are also improving and establishing new laws and legislations, do you have any suggestions to share to our Chinese colleagues? Thank you.
Well, the current administration, the Biden administration, has as one of its legislative agenda items reinstating the Superfund tax. As I said earlier, when the law was first enacted, there was a tax on the chemical and petroleum industries, and the money that came from that tax formed the basis for the Superfund, from which money could be used to clean up those sites for which there are no responsible parties remaining who are liable and viable anymore. So one thing that certainly we would like to see is the reinstatement of that tax to better address the backlog of sites that need to be cleaned up. I'm glad that one of the earlier, or I believe that you referred to community engagement. One thing that one of the main focuses of the current administration is addressing community engagement and making it more active at sites so that communities have a better say in how their the sites that are near them are cleaned up. This is a particular problem because of the belief that many disadvantaged communities, that are populated by poorer people or people of color, have been treated differently or less, that their cleanups have been performed, that the cleanups are slower or have not been as aggressive as in other parts of the country. This administration has committed to address better community engagement and addressing what are called environmental justice communities. So that's another focus of the current administration, is ensuring that all people have the property near them cleaned up, regardless of their income or any other characteristics they possess. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but if you would like to ask me something else, I'm happy to try.
I will just turn the mic to our Chinese colleagues. What do you think about Ken's suggestion? Professor Wang Lan, do you want to respond to that?
我没有其他要回应的，但是我想就是问几个关于
I don't have much to respond, but I have several questions about CERCLA, the Superfund law, about site contamination in China and abandoned mines. We have the fund mechanism, which has referred to some of the contents of a Superfund law. But we do not know, and we do not have the detailed implementation rules. We haven't clarified who can apply for the fund. For the Superfund law, what are the rules for the applicants who can apply for the fund, and what are the rules for establishing the funds?
Well, traditionally, the Superfund itself is not a source of funding for private industry. The appropriated laws that are considered Superfund dollars, I'm sorry, the appropriated funds that are considered Superfund or site remediation funds are for use at cleaning up sites where there are no companies left to perform the cleanup. It is not a fund that is accessible by private industry. It is only for the use of the government for purposes of cleaning up those sites where there are no private entities. In this country, we do have, though, as you've alluded to, a large number of Superfund or hazardous substance contaminated sites that are mining sites, but they are treated just like the other sites. They are addressed by the private industry that contributed to those sites when those companies still are viable and liable. They still exist. And to the extent those companies aren't able to do that cleanup because they no longer exist or don't have the money anymore, the federal government pays for their cleanup. So, but the fund is not available for access by private industry to help them pay for their obligations under CERCLA. I hope that's responsive to your question.
Dr. Wang, would you like to respond? No, thank you. Okay, so Ms. Zhang, do you have anything to add? So if not, we're going to jump to the next question. Sorry, I muted myself. No more from me. Thank you.
So I will just again, as I said earlier in when the panelists were giving their presentation, that what Tiago brings us to this brings to the discussion is the eco-based, ecosystem-based immediate adaptation perspective and financing that. And I mean, after listening to what Professor Wang Lan was sharing, that there are actually multiple funds in China to, for example, to finance actions on prevention and pollution control, on air pollution, on water pollution, on ecosystem compensation, etc. There are many funds available, multiple tracks out there. How can we coordinate these funds to serve multiple purpose, especially when soil, for example, as we discussed yesterday, that soil can serve, soil itself has multiple functions, it's an interface to a lot of ecosystems, and maintaining and restoring a healthy soil can also come out with co-benefits. So I want to pose this question to Tiago. What do you think? Do you think we can have the chance to redesign, to coordinate, or come up with some new mechanisms, vehicles to achieve these multiple goals and the multiple purposes in the multiple crises that we're facing today?
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. I think what we see is that there are many of these issues that overlap or that are linking issues. So, but despite of being linking issues that could have multiple benefits, they're often still treated in a siloed way. So you have the different ministries, the environmental ministry, the agricultural ministry, the mining, the development, and they don't coordinate with each other. And the same thing for the financiers, both public and private. So to the extent that they can coordinate with each other, we could find more holistic solutions to these problems. We still get into the issue of the scale of finance, right? So I'll give you an example. So we do have in Europe, for instance, a number of payment for ecosystem services that would cover some of those costs on restoring soil, degraded soil. This could help also to deal with, heavily contaminated soil, but it would only help to a certain extent. We also have new legislation coming in the UK, which says, or which promotes the idea of, public money for public goods. So whenever you have farmers or owners that are dealing with their land in a way that they create multiple public goods, they should be rewarded for that. So that's basically on the basis of fiscal policies. Again, in the US, maybe this might be a link as well, but under the Biden administration, there is a good focus on soil carbon activities and creating, there is a bipartisan proposal to create some sort of a carbon bank for farmers, where they would be rewarded and remunerated for reestablishing the health and productivity of soils. So I think there are entry points where one thing could lead to some additional resources for dealing with contaminated soil as well. The thing is, we still need scale, and the costs sometimes are just so high that those initiatives will not be nearly enough to start dealing with the problem. So we still need the private sector to come in. And then again, when we need the private sector to come in, I think the solution is more on creating demand for these investments. And maybe one way which this could happen is if those number of reporting, sustainability reporting initiatives that we have mushrooming today, which are voluntary, if they become mandatory and they establish that companies really need to deal with those issues within their supply chain, and not only from the climate aspect, but also from the nature aspect, so both climate risks and nature-related risks, that could also create more demand for those companies to start acting on that, so that burden could be shared between governments and private entities. But all in all, it's a question of more regulation and a question of more coordination to get those entry points and synergies.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left, and I would just I will bring back the question that Matthew mentioned in the beginning of his remark. He raised the 3 questions, but I'm going to ask only 2 because I'm the moderator. I'm not going to make the choice. And I'll turn the microphone to each of you, and you can choose to answer either both or one of them, but keep your answer short. One question is about the emergency, the time emergency. How can we bridge the time gap between debt financing that may be provided to insurance of bonds? That's a very technical term here, but I think it's a very particular situation. And also the fact that the remediation takes time, and we are also facing a lot of fields that need to be remediated. How can we deal with that emergency, and what's the best solution? What's the principle, at least, to deal with that emergency? And the other question is about prevention, as we repeatedly bringing up this about prevention is the key. Prevention is key. So how can we prevent soil contamination from happening? And what's the role of private finance in that? And of course, we can also talk about other stakeholders like community, like government leaders. I will turn the microphone to Dr. Zhang first. 张所长，能不能请您先回答一下这个问题？请尽量简短。
Dr. Zhang, please try to be brief. This is the last question. So I'll choose the second question. I think in terms of prevention, well, definitely prevention is less costly compared to the treatment or remediation. So prevention is more important than treatment. And to do the prevention well, I think we need to have strict law enforcement. Now, in terms of the environmental protection, we have full-fledged laws and regulations. However, in the law enforcement, there might be some local protectionism, and local government might want to develop the economy more. So we need to really enforce these environmental law discipline or enhance the law enforcement to avoid the pollution. Thank you.
Professor Wang Lan, do you want to share 1 or 2 of the questions? Your remark on 1 to 2 questions.
So just a follow-up to what Ms. Zhang and also Tiago said. Well, in terms of prevention, we have already thought about this. I think in our measures for the administration of the fund, these measures were issued by different departments. For example, the administrative measures for the special fund on the soil remediation were issued by 6 government agencies together. So they do have these integrated approach that combine the air and the land and even the ocean. So in terms of the prevention, we have these so-called precautionary principle and prevention first principle to really tighten the law enforcement. And then in terms of the treatment, we have these compensation mechanism to make sure that the responsible parties will pay for the losses and the damages. And then in addition, we also avoid these newly added contaminated sites. So that is a priority in our work too.
I just want to remind you, we only have 6 minutes left for our session. So if you have any intervention, please keep it very, very short. I'm sorry about that. I've turned it to Tiago. Perhaps go ahead, please.
But perhaps I think one example where we could use prevention, but also talking here from a climate angle, is that there is already some market being created in avoided degradation, for instance, which would contribute quite a lot for soil restoration as well, or for soil preservation in that case. So I think that could be a model. This model can or not be linked to carbon markets. So there's also the system that we call results-based finance, which is not linked to carbon markets at all, but still provide finance for developing countries, for instance, to prevent deforestation and degradation of huge tracts of land. Of course, it's not easy. There are a number of rules around it, but it's still a way to promote that sort of prevention. Although I do think we need both. There's a lot to be restored up there, and there's a lot of also to be prevented. So I think we need to work with both.
Thank you. Ken, do you want to make your final remark?
By way of prevention, the circular, the Superfund law, was never intended to address anything except abandoned hazardous waste sites. That was its original intent. We have a whole body of other laws that govern how solid and hazardous waste is disposed of, that govern the handling of chemicals, that govern recycling. So I agree with my colleague from China that the enforcement of our regulatory laws is the best way to prevent Superfund sites. Thank you.
Thank you. Ingvild, it's your turn.
I think you have come up with good solutions already. But yeah, really make it easy to comply, maybe. Not that legislation is too weak, but to make it easier to kind of dispose those hazardous waste to a proper place where it's handled properly. And also maybe some education of the importance of keeping our soil and water clean.
Thank you. Thank all the panelists and participants for your questions, and thank our interpreter and our staff. I just to give a few key takeaways. From my own in the last 3 days session, and I think all greater government plays a central role in setting clear rules, legislation standards, and also on law enforcement. And in many cases, like in China, financing is also a major part of the government's role in soil remediation projects, especially for the orphan sites and heritage sites. But in addition to urban brownfields, whose remediation costs can be compensated, often financed, covered by private sector. But the private sector, we do face a huge challenge in China and as well in seeking affordable, scalable, effective technologies and services and affordable finance, among others, to restore and remediate agricultural lands, forests, wetlands, etc. And the challenge, however, is always to bridge the gap that we already identified. We have gap in knowledge production, in scientific research, in transforming the knowledge to technologies that can be applied and industrialized. And, also bridging the gap in policymaking and public and private financing, etc. And also, as we have repeatedly mentioned, the communication with stakeholders, among stakeholders, and with communities. And in China, the US, and the EU, we have witnessed quite a lot of emerging technologies that are based on natural solutions, which can not only serve for just one single purpose of remediating the polluted soil, but also hitting a few other sustainable development goals, such as food, water, climate, health, biodiversity, etc. And we are very encouraging. It's very encouraging to see new financing vehicles coming out, not just on the front of financing nature-based solutions, climate adaptation mitigation, but also new tools on financing soil projects, including public finance projects, etc. And finally, prevention is the key, and we can't emphasize that enough. Prevention, prevention, prevention. And with all that, I'm going to close the panel, the 3-day session 2. And thank you again, everyone, for your participation, and keep on your great work, and have a good day, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.